There is not a gentleman in this room who would stand up with her, and I will lay £50 upon it. Miss Amabel Craik pitched it into the exact hush between the end of one set and the beginning of the next, so that it carried the whole length of Lady Renmarch's ballroom, and then she added, sweetly, for the people who had not been attending, you will observe the gown. It was mine 2 seasons since. She dyed it and turned it herself in the evenings after the stockings. Orlando, Duke of Ivorly, standing against a pillar at the far end of the room with a glass he had not touched, watched 400 people laugh. He watched the sets form and reform and leave a space in the middle of that shining floor. And in the space stood a young woman in a made-over gown the colour of old moss, quite alone, with her hands at her sides and her chin level, not weeping, not fleeing, waiting the thing out the way one waits out weather. He had been looking for her for 14 months. He set down the glass. He had come to this ball for 20 minutes out of duty to his godmother and had not danced in 6 years, and the crowd opened in front of him without his asking it to, because that is what crowds did. Miss Craik. The girl's colour went up. Your Grace, I did not. £50, I think you said. That no gentleman here would stand up with this lady. He let the room hear him. He had a voice that carried without being raised, and he had never before found a use for it that gave him the smallest pleasure. Then you may consider your money quite safe. I am not a gentleman, Miss Craik. I am a duke, and I'm about to be extremely disobliging. He turned and bowed and held out his hand. The young woman in the moss-green gown looked at it for a long moment. Then she put her fingers into his palm and let him lead her out, and the musicians, being professionals, struck up as though nothing whatever had occurred. She danced well. He had expected her to shake, and she did not. Her hand was cold in his and perfectly steady, and she moved down the set with her back straight and her eyes on him and not one glance to either side. You need not do this, Your Grace, she said, when the figure brought them close. I am aware. They will say a great many things. They will say them anyway, said Ivorly, and considerably louder about me than about you, which is the single advantage of my position and the first time in my life I have found it worth having. The figure parted them. When it brought her back, he said, You have not asked me for anything, not once, since I crossed the floor. Why is that? Because I have nothing to pay with, said Miss Henrietta Bexley, and I have learned what happens to a woman who takes what she cannot pay for. At the end of the set he did not return her to the wall where the shawls were kept. He led her the length of the room to his godmother's chair, and set her hand on the arm of it, and said, into a silence that had grown thick enough to lean upon, Miss Bexley, will you permit me to call upon you tomorrow? 400 people waited for her answer. Yes, Your Grace, she said, because there was nothing else on earth she could have said, and he knew it and was ashamed of it before he had reached the door. He called at 11 the next morning at the Craik house in Belmont Street, and was shown into a drawing-room in which Lady Craik had clearly been arranging herself for an hour, and was obliged to sit through 11 minutes of raptures about the honour, the very great honour, and dear Henrietta's astonishing good fortune, before the lady herself was permitted into the room. She came in with her hands folded and her face composed, and she did not sit down. Mamma, said Lady Craik, radiant, we shall leave them. You need not, said Henrietta. His Grace will not be staying. The door shut. Ivorly, standing, found that his heart was going unevenly, which had not happened to him since he was 19. Miss Bexley, I am very grateful to you. She said it steadily, and he understood at once that she had been up all night making it steady. You will not believe how grateful, and I shall be grateful to the end of my life. But I must say the rest of it, and then I shall ring for your hat. She drew a breath. Everybody in London knows that Lady Craik hunted you for 2 seasons for her daughter, and that you refused her publicly at Torrings, and that Miss Craik has not forgiven it. And last night, in front of the whole of the ton, you took the person that family despises most and you raised her up in the middle of the floor. Her voice did not break. It was magnificent, Your Grace. It was the finest thing I have ever seen done in a ballroom, but you did not see me. You saw a stick to beat them with. That is not. I have been useful my whole life, she went on, to people who did not see me. I was useful to my aunt, and I am useful to my cousin, and I mend and I write letters and I hold the shawls. and I have made my peace with all of it. But I will not be useful in a quarrel. I will not be the instrument that a great man uses upon a foolish woman, and be handed back to the wall when the point is made. She looked at him then straight on, exactly as she had, in the middle of the floor. You are very kind, and I am nobody, and there is no version of tomorrow in which I do not pay for last night. Let it be a single dance. It was worth a great deal to me. Do not make it a debt. He stood in the middle of Lady Crake's ugly gilt drawing-room and did not argue, because she was right about everything except the one thing that mattered, and he could see that saying so would sound exactly like every other thing a duke had ever said to a woman without a shilling. So he bowed and took his hat and went out past Lady Crake's stricken face and got into his carriage and gave his coachman an address that was not his own. Ossory House, he said, and spring them. The Dowager Lady Ossory was 83, deaf as the fender, and the only person alive who had never been afraid of him. You will have to speak up, she said, when he had shouted the whole business at her across the tea-table, and you will have to speak sense, which is harder. Who is the girl? You have met her. 14 months ago, at the summer breakfast at Torring's. I meet a great many people. I remember almost none of them, which is one of the mercies of my age. You will remember this one, said Ivorly. It was the hot day. The party went down to the lake for the boats, and you had been wheeled into the conservatory to be out of the sun, and everybody who had promised to come back for you forgot. There were 3 hours between the boats and the fireworks. The old woman's hands went still on her stick. There was a girl, she said. There was a girl. She stayed. She fanned you with a folded programme for 3 hours in a glasshouse in July, and fetched you water twice from the far end of the terrace. And she shouted cheerful nonsense at you the whole time, so that you should not be humiliated by having to ask people to repeat themselves. He heard his own voice go rough and let it. I watched the entire thing from the upper terrace, and I did not go down, because I was 36 years old and a coward about conservatories full of dowagers, and I have thought about it perhaps once a week ever since. She missed the boats. She missed the fireworks. Her own party went home without noticing she had not been with them. I sent her a note, said Lady Ossory. I never had an answer. No, you would not have. I asked who she was that evening, and I was told. He stopped. He made himself say it, because he had been carrying the words about for 14 months like a stone in his boot. I was told. Nobody. A companion. And I said, ah, and I did not ask again, and I have gone to every insufferable ball in this city for a year looking for a face I had seen once through glass and telling myself I would know it when I saw it. There was a considerable silence. Her name, said Lady Ossory, is what? Bexley. Henrietta Bexley. Then get out of my way, said the dowager, hauling herself up on her stick, and send for my carriage, and do not on any account come with me. You are a duke, and dukes are of no use to a woman who has just been told she is a stick to beat somebody with. What that girl wants is a wage and a bedroom with a bolt on the door, and I have a great many of both. Henrietta Bexley left Belmont Street 4 days later with one trunk, as companion to the Dowager Lady Ossory at £80 a year and her own sitting-room. Ivorly was not permitted to be present. He heard about it afterwards from his godmother, at length, with relish. Lady Crake came to Ossory House on the Tuesday to reclaim her property and was received, at the Dowager's particular instruction, in the hall. She is a dependent of mine, Lady Crake said. She is under my protection. Is she indeed? Said Lady Ossory, who could hear perfectly well when she chose. Then I congratulate you upon your protection, madam. I saw it exercised at Wrenmarch House, and it was a most instructive performance. Bexley remains here. You may have your gown back. She has left it folded on the bed, and I understand it was yours to begin with. Good morning. The rest of it took the season, and Ivorly did none of it cleverly. He called on his godmother twice a week, which he had not done in years, and drank a great deal of bad tea, and sat with 2 women in a small back parlour that smelled of hyacinths, while an 83-year-old woman openly and shamelessly refused to leave the room. He learned that Henrietta Bexley had a wicked flat way of describing people that could take a man's legs out from under him. He learned that she had been taught Italian by her father, who had been a scholar and a poor manager, and that she had sold his books to bury him. He learned that she disliked being thanked. He did not speak of the ball, he waited to be asked. She asked in June in the garden with the rain coming on. "Why did you not ask my name?" she said. "That day at Torring's. You were on the terrace." "I know you were. I saw a man in a grey coat looking down, and I thought, how splendid, someone will come, and nobody came." "I asked," said Ivorly. "That evening. I asked Torrings's sister who the young woman in the conservatory was, and she said nobody, a companion." He looked at the wet gravel. "And I said, ah, and turned back to my dinner, and let a woman I had watched be good for 3 hours be filed away under nobody, because it was easier than asking twice. That is what I have to tell you about myself, Miss Bexley, and it is not to my credit, and it is the reason I crossed that ballroom." He made himself look up. "Not to injure the Crakes. I have not thought of the Crakes in 2 years. I crossed it because I had spent 14 months finding out what it costs to let a person be nobody, and I was not going to stand at the side of the room and watch it happen twice. The rain came down properly then, all at once, the way it does in June. Henrietta Bexley stood in it and did not move to the shelter of the wall, and neither did he. "I have £80 a year," she said, unsteadily, "and a sitting room and a bolt on my door, and I did not know until I had them how much I had wanted them. I will not give them up to be rescued." "I am not offering to rescue you. I am offering to be the man who asks twice." He took one step and no more. "Marry me, Henrietta. I have the worst temper in England, and I do not dance, and I shall be perfectly unbearable in November. But I have never in my life been able to look away from you, and if you send me off I shall go, and I shall keep coming to my godmother's parlour on Tuesdays until I die, because that hour is the best thing in my week, and I am not proud enough to give it up." She began to laugh, and then she was not laughing, and she came to him across the wet grass and put her hand flat against his chest, and he bent his head, and the rain fell on both of them, and the Dowager Lady Ossory watched the entire proceeding from the parlour window without the smallest shame. They were married quietly at the end of July. Lady Remmarch's ball opened the season again in the spring, and the Duke and Duchess of Ivorly were announced at the head of the stairs into a room that went, for the second time in 14 months, extremely quiet. He walked her the length of it. He stopped in front of Miss Amabel Craik, whose engagement to a viscount had evaporated in the autumn, and whose mother's invitations had thinned to almost nothing, and who had gone the colour of paper. "Miss Craik, last season in this room you laid £50 that no gentleman here would stand up with Miss Bexley." He drew a folded note from his coat and laid it on the little table at her elbow. "You were quite right, and I have come to pay you. There was no gentleman in the room. There was only me." He turned to the 400. "My wife found a deaf old woman in a hot conservatory for 3 hours at Torring's while every one of you was down at the lake," he said pleasantly. "I understand it went unremarked at the time. I mention it now." And then he led the Duchess of Ivorly out onto the floor and danced with her, badly for the second time in 7 years. She asked him afterwards in the carriage whether he had enjoyed the Craik girl's face. "No," said Ivorly, and found to his own surprise that it was true. "I have no appetite for it at all. She is a stupid child who was taught to be cruel by a stupid woman, and I would not spend another quarter-hour on either of them." He turned her hand over in his and kissed the palm of it, where the mending needle had left its small hard mark, and had left it since she was 17. "I only wanted the room to hear your name said properly, once, out loud, by someone who had asked twice."